I'm James.
And I'm Emily.
We're from Allegheny College talking about groundwater.
So, water is an extremely important part of an ecosystem, and it comes from two different types of sources, surface water and groundwater. Now, a question I want to ask all of you guys is, do you happen to know any examples of surface water or even groundwater? Now, surface water is the water that we usually think of, with a few examples being stuff like lakes, rivers, and streams, stuff that we'll usually use for canoeing or fishing or things like that. And often these types of sources are also used for systems like irrigation for agriculture and hydroelectric power. Groundwater is a part of the precipitation cycle, where water will seep into the soil and become stored between rock particles underground. Slowly, the water between these rock particles will begin to move underground and may run into streams, lakes, and oceans to become surface water. This is where a lot of the water comes from whenever surface systems aren't getting a lot of new water through stuff like rain or storms.
Here we have our groundwater model, and it's designed to show it to let us see how water moves through the ground, kind of like how you can use an ant farm to see what the ants are doing underground, right? So it's the same kind of idea here, and we've got different things to show us, different things to work with here. So we've got different layers of sediment types. So we've got a lot finer, more like sandy, dirt kind of sediment here. And we have something a little bit more rockier here, and then something with a lot bigger chunks here. And we also have different things up here that represent things like wells, underground storage tanks, like where gas stations store their gasoline underground, septic tanks for wastewater, and we have lakes, more wells over here, and a stream. I'm going to be putting a little bit of food coloring into each of these wells here to represent pollution. But before we do that, let's just take a moment to hypothesize how the water is going, or how the dye is going to move through the system, through the model, and especially paying attention to the different types of sediment here and how quickly the food coloring will move through each layer of sediment.
As we watch the model, we just very quickly wanted to ask you, what kinds of pollution do you think can affect groundwater? A few different kinds of pollution that can affect groundwater include septic tanks, wells, and things like acid mine drainage. If a pollutant were to contaminate a well, that would also seep into groundwater, and septic tanks can also get holes in them, which can cause pollution as well. If any of you who are viewing this video live in a rural area such as the countryside, you very, very well have well water, which needs to be regularly tested to prevent pollutants. One example that you guys probably have never heard before is the acid mine drainage. Acid mine drainage is when groundwater seeps into an abandoned mine and dissolves materials such as metals, which includes dangerous metals such as arsenic. These metals then seep back into the groundwater, and as we see in this model, the groundwater will seep into a stream and cause a disruption to the ecosystem there.
So now that the model has had some time to run, let's look back at what we saw. So one thing the first thing to note is that the dye from well 1 spread out and moved quickly across the bottom layer there, while it took longer for wells 2 and 3 to move through the second layer here. Other important thing to note is that as we can see over here, how dye moved upwards and contaminated the stream there, and that kind of shows how a lot of streams are fed from groundwater, right? So even if it hasn't rained in a long time, the stream is still flowing. That's because they're fed by groundwater. So if the groundwater that's feeding the stream becomes polluted, then the stream is going to be polluted too. So that's an important thing to think about whenever groundwater, or your for keeping, another important reason to keep groundwater clean. Another important thing to note here is how we can see how these are wells, right? So especially in rural areas where people get their water from wells, if the groundwater they're taking that their well is drawing from is polluted, that's a problem, because that means their drinking water is polluted, and that's really bad. So that's one thing that we need to be really careful of with pollution. One way groundwater can become polluted is with holes in like an underground storage tank or a septic tank. People in rural areas, it's pretty common for people in rural areas to have septic tanks to store their wastewater, for it to break down and be in storage until a truck can come by and empty it out for them. And underground storage tanks are usually for like gasoline or natural gas. Probably the most common type are the ones that are underneath gas stations, where they hold all the gasoline. They're typically held in underground storage tanks. And if those get a leak, even if it's a really small one, it can cause lots of pollution to all the ground around it, and can have pretty big effects on the groundwater, and even stuff going on at the surface if all the soil gets contaminated. All right. So to wrap up, let's make a little diagram of what we learned today. So let's start with a circle having for water quality, and then two circles branching off for groundwater and surface water. And then after that, let's make a little bubble for each of the different topics we talked about today. And then you can even draw lines between them to talk about how those might be related to each other as well.